There's a family you've never heard of that made the Sacklers look like amateurs, a dynasty that didn't just profit from addiction, they industrialized it, weaponized it, and turned an entire nation into their customer base. The Sackler family, the ones behind OxyContin, destroyed hundreds of thousands of American lives and made $20 billion before anyone stopped them. But a century before that, another family did the exact same thing on a scale 10 times larger. They addicted millions, they destroyed generations, they shaped the entire economy of Asia. And when it was over, when the bodies were counted and the damage was done, they didn't go to prison, they got knighthoods, they got statues, they got their names carved into hospitals. And universities, because that's how drug empires work. You make your money destroying lives. You launder it through charity. And by the time anyone realizes what happened, you're too respectable to touch. This is the story of the Sassoon family, the opium cartel that built modern India, bankrupted China, and walked away as heroes. And if you think this is ancient history, if you think we learned our lesson, look at your medicine cabinet, because the same playbook is running right now. The names changed, the drug changed, but the con is identical, and it's happening on an even larger scale. The Sassoons didn't just sell drugs, they perfected the state-backed criminal enterprise that the Sacklers merely copied. Let me show you the 3 repeating patterns of the narco-state. Let's start in the 1830s. A Jewish merchant family, the Sassoons, flees persecution in Baghdad and arrives in Bombay, British India. They are walking into the epicenter of the most toxic financial crisis in world history, a crisis born from pure consumer greed. The British Empire had an addiction: tea, silk, and porcelain. By the early 1800s, British upper classes were addicted to Chinese goods, and China demanded payment in one currency only: silver. China didn't want British wool or British manufactured goods. They had superior products and zero interest in the goods of what they saw as minor foreign barbarians. The result? The British Empire was bleeding silver. Every year, millions of pounds of hard currency flowed out of British coffers into Chinese hands. By some estimates, Britain was losing $8 million of silver annually, a staggering drain that threatened the solvency of the entire monetary system. This was not merely a trade deficit, it was the financial structure of an empire cannibalizing itself. London tried everything: negotiation, diplomatic channels, even trying to smuggle seeds out of China to grow tea elsewhere. They failed. The British answer was one of the most evil economic strategies ever conceived, a strategy that redefined the boundaries of state-sponsored crime. Their solution was simple, brutal, and utterly brilliant: grow opium in India and flood China with it. The plan was a direct financial warfare tactic. Get millions of Chinese addicted. Suddenly, instead of Chinese merchants demanding silver for tea, Chinese addicts are forced to pay silver for opium. The trade deficit reverses overnight. Britain profits massively. India becomes a narcotics plantation, and China drowns in addiction. Let's be clear. The British East India Company, a private corporate state with its own army, its own laws, and its own shareholders, was deliberately creating a drug epidemic. They were doing it with full knowledge of opium's destructive power, having seen its effects in controlled medical use. They knew that large-scale consumption led to dependency, physical ruin, and societal collapse. They knew this, and yet they did it anyway because the economics worked. The profit margins justified the human cost. By 1830, British India was producing over 1,500 tons of opium annually, nearly all of it destined for China. The company controlled the entire operation, from licensing farmers to processing it in its factories. The financial structure of British India, roads, schools, military salaries, administration, was all funded in part by opium. Opium revenue accounted for roughly 14% of British India's total revenue. This was not a criminal enterprise operating in the shadows. This was official government policy, funded by addiction. And this was the system David Sassoon walked into, recognizing immediately that the British had created a perfectly legal, perfectly protected criminal enterprise. David Sassoon arrived with almost nothing, but he had the connections and the cunning to see where the real power lay. Other merchants were content to be mere middlemen, buying opium at auction and shipping it. Sassoon understood that if you want to build an empire, you don't just participate in the system, you control the entire mechanism of vice. The Sassoons didn't just sell opium, they controlled every single element of the supply chain, creating a self-sustaining, self-insuring monopoly on vice that eliminated external risk and kept all profits internal. The financial weaponization of agriculture. They provided the financing to Indian farmers, often in the form of ruinous loans, coercing them to grow poppies instead of desperately needed food crops. This forced Indian agriculture to become subservient to a single toxic export commodity. Sassoon held the debt. Sassoon controlled the output. Logistical dominance and internal profit. To eliminate reliance on other shippers, they built their own fleet of clipper ships. These vessels, often faster and more reliable than others, ensured the rapid and steady flow of narcotics. They ran their own insurance companies to protect those ships. When a cargo was lost to a storm or Chinese authorities, the financial loss was mitigated by their own insurance firm. The profit never left the family's internal ecosystem. Distribution and political engineering. They established a network of sophisticated agents in every port city from Kolkata to Canton. These men were linguistically and politically adept, capable of navigating the murky waters between British colonial law and bribing corrupt Chinese officials. They secured the best warehouses, the fastest customs clearances, and the most reliable local smugglers. Within a few years, the Sassoons dominated the trade through logistics, connections, and relentless efficiency. By the 1830s, they were shipping 30,000 chests of opium annually. By the 1850s, it swelled to 59,000 chests, over 7 million pounds of refined narcotics annually. The scale is almost unimaginable. This was an industrial-scale addiction machine. The Sassoons weren't rebels. They were the perfect collaborators for an empire that needed someone to do the dirty work while keeping their hands officially clean. This relationship was symbiotic. The British government got a vast narcotics trade without direct involvement, and the Sassoons got the ultimate prize: protection, legal legitimacy, and military backing in the world's most profitable market. China's coastal cities collapsed into addiction. Productivity plummeted, silver vanished, fathers smoked themselves into oblivion while their children starved. The Sassoons were getting rich, and the empire was balancing its books. This was the first large-scale, state-backed narco operation in modern history, run by businessmen with British titles, not street criminals. In 1839, the Chinese government, watching its population and economy disintegrate, finally tries to stop it. Commissioner Lin Zexu, an incorruptible official, moved fast. He confiscated over 1,400 tons of opium from foreign merchants, including Sassoon's rivals, and destroyed it publicly. He sent a respectful, devastating letter to Queen Victoria asking, "How can Britain morally justify selling a substance to China that is banned and controlled in Britain itself?" The British response to this moral question? They declare war. This is pattern number 2 of the narco-state, the military protection of profit. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, was not a fight over honor or free trade. It was a fight over economic necessity and protecting corporate property. Destroying that opium threatened the entire British economic model, which was now dangerously dependent on the drug money. Britain sent gunboats to save its balance sheet and protect the wealth of its merchant class, including the Sassoons. The resulting Treaty of Nanking, 1842, was not a peace treaty. It was a financial decree backed by naval power. 1. China had to pay Britain $21 million silver dollars for the destroyed opium and war costs. China paid for the war started against it to force it to accept drugs. 2. China had to open 5 ports to British trade. 3. China had to cede Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, a perfect deep-water hub for the narcotics trade. 4. And China had to grant British citizens extraterritoriality, meaning Sassoon agents could operate with near-total immunity from Chinese law. The treaty didn't legalize opium, but by opening the ports, the trade became militarily unstoppable. The Sassoons, who provided ships and financial guarantees to the war effort, were rewarded with first access to the new ports. The floodgates were open, and the opium trade exploded. When China resisted again in the 1850s, Britain and France launched the Second Opium War, 1856-1860. The culmination of this assault was the occupation of Beijing and the barbaric burning of the Old Summer Palace, an act of cultural and financial annihilation designed to break the will of the Chinese state. The resulting Treaty of Tientsin legalized the opium trade explicitly. The Sassoons didn't have to hide anymore. Their wealth exploded, protected and sanctioned by the most powerful military on earth. This confirmed the pattern. The state exists to protect the profit model of its most powerful commercial entities, even if that model is mass addiction. By the 1850s, the Sassoons were operating the largest private merchant empire in Asia, moving from opium into cotton, banking, and real estate. But they understood that money alone doesn't buy respectability, it buys insurance and perpetual immunity. This is pattern number 3 of the narco-state, institutional legitimacy as insurance. Every rupee they made from opium was immediately laundered into visible, public-facing, and respectable projects. They made themselves indispensable to the colonial economy of Bombay. If you are the person who funds the city's docks and banks, the city will not ask too loudly where the money came from. More critically, they began their massive philanthropy campaign, the greatest reputation laundering scheme of the 19th century. They funded the David Sassoon Library and Reading Room in Bombay, still standing, still used. They funded the Sassoon Dock, one of Bombay's most important commercial ports. They funded hospitals, synagogues, schools, and orphanages, plastering their name on every institution. David Sassoon became a sheriff of Bombay. His son Albert was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Star of India, a British title for a Jewish merchant whose fortune came from drugging China. Albert became the first Jew ever granted the freedom of the City of London. The opium profits brought them social and political status far above the most established financial dynasties. This is how you launder a drug fortune. You don't hide it, you showcase it, you plaster your name on every building, you align yourself so tightly with power that attacking you means attacking the empire itself. The libraries and hospitals were not just charity, they were insurance, ensuring that when the history books were written, the Sassoons would be remembered as benefactors, not drug lords. The public looks at the Sassoon name on these institutions and is conditioned to think generous, politely ignoring the blood-soaked source of the funds. Charity is the final profitable disposal of blood money. The Sassoon Empire in China ended with ideological vengeance. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party took control. One of their first acts was to nationalize all foreign assets. Every building, every business, every investment Victor Sassoon owned was seized by the state, with zero compensation. The Communist Party used the memory of the Opium Wars and the exploitation by merchants like the Sassoons as propaganda to justify their revolution. The Sassoons became a symbol of everything China was rejecting. The family eventually scattered. The company was humiliated and dissolved. The wealth dissipated. But the structures remain. The libraries, the docks, the hospitals still stand in Mumbai. The family is forgotten by the public, but the blood money remains embedded in the institutions of two continents. The lesson is clear. Drug empires are temporary, but the blood money is permanent. They make fortunes, they corrupt institutions, they destroy lives, but the wealth is simply recycled, ready for the next generation to inherit a clean, sanitized fortune. Now look at the Sacklers. The pattern is not merely similar, it is identical. The Sassoons dealt in opium, the botanical narcotic. A century later, the Sacklers dealt in opioids, the synthetic narcotic. The underlying product is different, but the goal is the same: industrialized addiction. The Sassoon operation was protected by the British East India Company and the Royal Navy. The Sackler operation was protected by FDA approval, regulatory capture, and congressional lobbying. The state backing is the difference between a gunboat and a cleverly worded law, but the result is yas al-mashruyat and military protection of profit. The human cost mirrors the financial blueprint. The Sassoons' trade resulted in the death and destitution of millions of Chinese lives. The Sacklers' greed resulted in the death of over 500,000 Americans. One family sought knighthoods and wealth retention. The other sought museum wings and wealth retention, paying a $4.5 billion fine out of an estimated $20 billion fortune, meaning the penalty was nothing more than the cost of doing business. This is not just about two families, it's about a permanent business model. The Sassoons shifted from opium to real estate. Modern Pharma shifts from opioids to different drug classes. The economics are identical. Create dependency, ensure repeat customers, profit for decades. The most dangerous truth is the shift in the modern medical system, from curing disease to managing chronic conditions. Sassoon created lifelong addicts to ensure profit. Modern medicine often creates lifelong patients for the exact same economic reason. Antidepressants, ADHD medications, cholesterol medications, all taken for life. Modern medicine calls it treatment. The Sassoons called it trade. But the economics are identical. Create permanent customers who pay monthly for the rest of their lives. History shows us the cycle. They rise with state backing. They profit from mass addiction. They buy legitimacy through philanthropy. They dissolve, leaving behind monuments to their generosity and graves filled with their victims. The Sassoons weren't held accountable. The Sacklers won't be fully held accountable. And the next family running this con is already being celebrated as visionaries and philanthropists. This isn't conspiracy, this is documented financial history. If this changed how you see the philanthropic names on your city's institutions, if you finally understand that charity is the ultimate form of corporate insurance, then you're starting to see the pattern. The Sassoons built modern Mumbai, they also destroyed millions of Chinese lives. Both things are true. The Sacklers funded medical research, they also killed hundreds of thousands through greed. Both things are true. The next family running this con is already in power. They are funding medical research, they are endowing universities, they are building museums. The question is, will we recognize the pattern before the next epidemic is declared a miracle? Subscribe if you want to understand how power actually works, because they're not going to teach you this in school. They're going to teach you that these families are generous, the contracts are public record, and the pattern has repeated for 150 years. They profit, we pay, and history buries the bodies.